And then I started to look at the comments to what I said. And there were things like, oh, of course he would say that. He teaches apologetics. Okay. Yeah, I do. So is that sort of like being a thief or a pathological liar, being an apologist? And of course, I have no degrees in apologetics. They're all in philosophy. You can't make someone intellectually serious if they don't want to be.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Alisa Childers podcast. I'm Alisa Childers and I have a great episode for you today. I'm actually really excited about this one because we're going to be talking about objections to apologetics. Very often when you engage with progressive Christians or even some atheists, they have this idea about Christian apologetics that it's just circling the wagons or repeating talking points. And I don't think people realize how robust a discipline it is. So we're going to talk all about that in today's episode with Dr. Doug Groothuis. I want to let you know that today's episode is brought to you by Brave Books, a Christian children's entertainment company that is so awesome. You can go to bravebooks.com/childers for 20% off. Again, bravebooks.com/childers. All right, before we get to this episode with Doug, I want to talk about a couple of upcoming announcements. So I want to let you know, first of all, that we have another episode of our Unshaken Faith podcast out. You can find that on YouTube. You can find it wherever you get your audio podcasts. And this is a long episode where Natasha and I, we read Jen Hatmaker's new best-selling book. In fact, this book called Awake sold 100,000 copies, I think, in its first 2 weeks. So this book is really getting into the hands of a lot of people. It's resonating with a lot of people. And in my view, after I read this book, ultimately what it is kind of a memoir of deconstruction, of trading Christianity for feminism, critical theory, and witchcraft. I mean, actual witchcraft that is recorded in the book that she is now engaging in. So it's important for women to hear this review because we talk through quite in depth some of the messages that Jen Hatmaker says are harmful. And then we take a biblical look at those and see, are they harmful? Or is this something that has maybe been mischaracterized? And we talk through all of those things. So don't miss that episode. And I also want to let you know that my new version of Another Gospel for Students is out now. It is available. You can get it all the places books are sold. And I am particularly excited about that today because I have just spent several hours recording the audio version. And I just love all of the changes that we made to the book, the things we've added, the places we've tightened up and clarified. There are little kind of side notes where we explain certain things. There are discussion questions at the end. So, Christmas is coming. Get this book for the students in your life. And then coming soon, there'll be an audio version with me reading that as well. And then finally, we have one more Unshaken Conference left. It's going to be on November 8th in the Dallas, Texas area. You can go to Unshaken Conference to register there. We would love to see you. We have had a lot of people buy tickets for this in the last few weeks. And I am just coming to it with a real sense of anticipation. We just finished our Southern California Unshaken, and we're going to be talking about exposing the darkness in all sorts of different areas when it comes to things like transgenderism, abortion, social justice versus biblical justice. What is the cultural moment that we're living in? We're going to come together with like-minded Christians and talk about all these things. So again, go to unshakenconference.com to register for that. And here's my conversation with Dr. Doug Groothuis. Well, Dr. Doug Groothuis, great to have you back on. You're kind of our now philosopher in residence. I think you've been on the show more times than anyone else, which is great.
Oh, my.
Yes. And so today we're going to talk about this is our All About Apologetics episode. So you and I have been communicating a little bit through Messenger about some of the anti-apologetics biases that we're seeing out there. And so my thought for this show today would be we could help our audience to understand, what apologetics really is and what it actually does, because there's a lot of misconceptions out there about that. But I'd love to start with, I don't know if we've ever talked about your story of what actually led you into apologetics. Can you share that with us?
Well, I can. I became a Christian in 1976 when I was 19. I had studied philosophy for a year in college and was also interested in Eastern religions. And the Lord got a hold of me in a number of ways. I actually have an essay online that I wrote for the Christian Research Journal a few years ago called Autobiography as Apologetics. So I weave my story into a defense of the Christian faith. People could look at that if they're interested. But you can relate to this. I was very involved in a charismatic church as a young Christian. And those folks helped lead me to the Lord, and I'll always be grateful. But it was really all based on spiritual experiences and the kind of sense of God's presence and speaking in tongues and things like that. And I am not against that at all. In fact, shocker to the world, I myself do sometimes speak in tongues, but not publicly. So I really didn't get grounded as an apologist until I started reading The Apologist. So my first book in apologetics was The God Who Is There by Francis Schaeffer, which is a classic defense of the Christian faith amidst later 20th century culture. In fact, I continue to read and listen to that. It's been so influential. And what Schaeffer did for me was to show me that Christianity was not only true, but pertinent to the whole of life for a thinking person. So you could look at the philosophers, the artists, the poets, and have something to say as a Christian that made a difference. And you could see that their worldview often led to what Schaeffer called despair. They could find no final reference point for meaning or truth in the world, and they collapsed in on themselves in various ways. And Schaeffer also taught me something about the spiritual life of an apologist, that we, first of all, need to depend on the Lord moment by moment for everything we do, our research, our writing, our teaching, our debates, whatever they are, and to love God and love our neighbor, love the person you're interacting with. And as he said, this is not a game that we're playing. We're not trying to score points against an enemy. Yeah, sure, I do want to win arguments. I mean, I've got 3 degrees in philosophy. I really want to win arguments, but I only want to win an argument if I'm right. And I don't want to win arguments at the expense of alienating a person or intimidating a person. So
Yeah.
that was really the story. It was reading Schaeffer, then reading all of Schaeffer's books, reading as much of C.S. Lewis, Jim Sire, Os Guinness, classic things like St. Augustine, and then, my great inspiration, I think, apologetically, I think Schaeffer and Pascal are on the same level, Blaise Pascal. Although
Yeah.
Schaeffer wrote a lot more and was more consistent in his biblical doctrine than Pascal.
Yeah.
So that was the journey.
Yeah, very cool. Well, and as my audience probably is aware of, at least my regular listeners, my journey into apologetics really was really born out of a faith crisis where I was just desperate for answers and I was looking for answers. And so I think that's why I've been lately kind of surprised to see some of the misconceptions about apologetics, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But first, I'd really like to just maybe talk about the real basics, like what actually is apologetics. Because I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast probably have some sort of an idea, but I want to make sure that we're defining it exactly what we mean. So if I were to just say, just at the most basic level, what is maybe what is apologetics, and then what is Christian
Right.
apologetics?
Right. Well, the word doesn't have very good PR because often the word apologist means a untrustworthy spokesman for a vested interest. Like that person
Right.
is just an apologist for big tobacco or an apologist for big pharma. But the word really means to give a defense for a claim or for a perspective. So the term technically is neutral. So there are Islamic apologists, there are apologists for socialism, and there are apologists for the Christian message. So the way I like to define apologetics, Christian apologetics, is that we're defending Christianity as objectively true, compellingly rational, and pertinent to the whole of life. There are other definitions. The classic biblical statement is 1 Peter 3:15, um, about having a reason for the hope that is within you and offering this with gentleness and respect to anyone who asks you. And so there are 2 key elements there: have an apology, have a reason for the hope, and offer it with gentleness and respect, not with arrogance or belligerence or anything like that. So
Yeah.
the field of apologetics is very broad. I wrote a very big very heavy, at least in physical weight, book called Christian Apologetics, 834 pages, I think it is. So there's a lot of ground to cover, and I've tried to do that. When I was at Denver Seminary for 31 years, I'm now at Cornerstone University and Seminary. I taught apologetics every year for 31 years. So that's a lot of time studying, teaching, answering questions. I try to get out into the world as much as possible. I don't like this idea of writing a defense of the Christian faith in a fortress, and then you're lobbing a bomb outside once in a while. That's an image that Schaeffer uses, but we should really try to bring the glorious message of God's work in Christ to the world and
Yeah.
listen to the questions people are asking and try to answer them as best we can with humility, but also confidence. If we really have studied and prayed and we have some authority, some unction from the Holy Spirit, we should do exploits in apologetics. And another thing I'll add is I, again, really side with Schaeffer on this, that he says that apologetics should be aimed at evangelism. So you could say that apologetics is a kind of pre-evangelism. So if you explain the gospel to someone and they say, well, that's interesting, but I think God is a universal force, not a personal being. Well, you don't just say the gospel again and hope it takes this time. You've got to go back and talk about why an infinite personal God makes much more sense of the universe and the human condition than some impersonal force or principle of Hinduism or Buddhism or something like that. So it's pre-evangelism, and then it also has the role of building up believers who are doubting. So Jude says, be merciful to those who doubt. We shouldn't bonk them over the head and say, you terrible person, why are you doubting? Just shut up and believe. That's not a kind or a biblical way of dealing with it. Even the great prophet John the Baptist had doubts. We see that in Matthew 11, 1 through 11. And Jesus responded by reciting his credentials as the Messiah. He said, go tell John that I'm working miracles, fulfilling the Old Testament. And then he builds up John. So even, this great prophet, actually the greatest of all the Old Testament prophets, because he was the herald of Jesus, the Messiah, apparently when he was in prison, struggled with doubts. And, Jesus didn't say, just believe or have faith in your faith or something like that. He gave the people that came to talk to John reason and evidence, said, go tell John that there's good reason to think I'm the Messiah.
Yeah. Well, when I started researching progressive Christianity and more specifically deconstruction, I noticed what a bad rap the word apologetics gets in those communities. And I think that it's based on a bunch of misconceptions about what apologetics really is. And I love the way you put it that apologetics is a neutral term. And so when we think about the conversations we have with people when we're sharing the gospel, and like you mentioned, they might have an objection that's really truly something they're wrestling with in their own heart. Like you could be sharing the gospel with somebody and they might say, well, I could never believe in a God who, and then fill in the blank. Or they might say, well, yeah, but you're asking me to believe based on the Bible, and I've heard all that there's all these contradictions in the Bible, or the Bible, it can't be trusted in the way that it was copied. Well, congratulations. From the minute you open your mouth after that, you're doing apologetics, because essentially you are giving reasons for why you can trust God, why the gospel is true, why the Bible is reliable, and those sorts of things. And so what I always tell Christians is you're already doing apologetics. And frankly, if we're going to be intellectually honest, so are the progressive Christians and the deconstructionists. They're doing apologetics as well. They're not doing anything different than we are, but we're utilizing several different disciplines, ones like some that you mentioned, like biblical scholarship, the study of history, archaeology, science, philosophy, whatever it might be, to be able to use reasons that are rooted in objective reality to make sense of what we're saying and to defend the claims that we're making. So I appreciate you saying that. Now I'm curious, one thing we could let our audience maybe know about is that there are different schools of thought within apologetics, and I'm going to take a wild guess and say you're probably more of a a classical apologist, like an evidentialist versus a presuppositionalist. Those are words that I remember hearing for the first time when I was first studying all of this, and everybody was going on about presuppositionalism versus evidentialism. And I felt so lost because I had never really heard either one of those words in that context before. So, is there maybe a simple way we could help the audience understand? I would say those are probably the two big schools, the two most prominent schools in apologetics. What is the difference? Like, what are the presuppositional school of thought and the evidential school of thought? And then what's the difference? Just a quick break to tell you about 7 Weeks Coffee, which is America's pro-life coffee company, and they're on a mission to fund the pro-life movement, one cup of coffee at a time. I get my espresso beans from 7 Weeks Coffee every single month. I absolutely love that this coffee is shade-grown, mold-free, low acid, no pesticides. It's organically farmed, and it's direct trade, which is better than the standards for fair trade. They have just hit an amazing milestone because one of the things they do is that with every sale, they donate 10% to pregnancy centers all across the country. And to date, thanks to so many of you who have subscribed to the Heartbeat Club and you get your beans every single month, they have donated $1 million to the pro-life movement. So you can check them out. We're coming up to Christmas, and what a great host gift to bring if you've been invited to someone's house or for a stocking stuffer. You can go to 7 Weeks Coffee and save 15% forever when you subscribe. Plus, you're going to get a free gift. But if you use my code Alisa, you're going to get an extra 10% off your first order. So make that first order count because you can buy all of your Christmas gifts for a total of 25% total savings on your first order. Again, go to 7weekscoffee.com, use my code Alisa.
So you wanted me to be on for 6 hours.
Yeah, I know. Right, yeah.
Yeah, that's a hard one to summarize, but I've written about this actually in my apologetics book because I have a chapter on apologetics method. But before I start, let me go to something Dwight Moody said, the great American evangelist. He was sometimes criticized for his methods of evangelism. And Moody said, well, you may criticize my methods of evangelism, but I think my way of doing evangelism is better than your way of not doing evangelism.
Yeah.
So, as far as I'm concerned, if anybody is out there and has a biblical worldview and they're defending the faith rationally, I salute that, whether you're a presuppositionalist or an evidentialist. To summarize, presuppositionalism has different proponents and different approaches, but it really emphasizes that without the Christian presuppositions, without the Christian worldview, we can't make sense of anything in life, the universe, the human condition, communication. And so we take apart the non-Christian worldview, and the presuppositionalists usually attack naturalism and atheism. They typically don't work on Islam or Eastern religions, but you can use that method for that. And they're against using evidence apart from a worldview framework. They would say, you just give evidence for the resurrection. You're not really dealing with the deep unbelief of the non-Christian, because that non-Christian can take that evidence and twist it. So the evidentialist really does emphasize historical claims from documents and archaeology. One of the great evidentialists that helped me tremendously as a young Christian was Josh McDowell, just a tireless apologist, evangelist. He wrote a book called Evidence That Demands a Verdict many years ago that's come out in multiple versions. The most recent one is written with his son, Sean, who's a very fine apologist in his own right. And what I do, I use a method that could be called classical apologetics, or in another way, it can be called cumulative case. And that is where you draw from a lot of different lines of argument. So there are a lot of very strong arguments for the existence of God or for theism, cosmological argument, design argument, moral argument. And that's one strain or one line of evidence. And if you've established theism, then you've defeated pantheism, atheism, polytheism. And then you can say, well, which of the monotheistic traditions is the most well supported by the evidence? And then you get down to Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And now we're into history. So we start appealing to the reliability of the Bible, its supernatural character, the teaching of the Bible, the gospel, that it gets the human condition right and offers us a reasonable hope for the future. So if you want to go into more depth, I have a chapter on apologetic method in my book, but let's not spend too much time arguing amongst ourselves about the
Yeah.
best method while people are going to hell all over the place. Now, I'm not saying that as somebody who says, oh, forget about theory, forget about philosophy, just get out there. Hey, I've got a PhD in philosophy. I wrote a book this big on
Hmm.
apologetics, but I don't like the fact when some of the apologists are arguing with the other ones about who has the most biblical method. There's a place for
Yeah.
that. Okay, do that work, figure out your method. And my method is, depending on how you view of it, classical apologetics or cumulative case. You've got your method. If you have a heart for the lost, all right, get out there and talk to unbelievers and build up Christians in the faith, and don't be carping with the apologists you disagree with.
No, I think that's really good that you said it that way because I always think about these issues with the mindset of the average Joe because that's me. I'm the average Joe. I'm not the person that has the masters in philosophy or apologetics or anything like that. I'm not exactly self-taught because I have been guided by Southern Evangelical Seminary where I've audited several classes, many classes, and taken a couple for credit. But for the most part, I'm the average person, and I probably don't understand the deep ins and outs of the different methods, precept versus evidential. I know that for me in my life, it was the evidence that I really needed the evidence at a certain point in my life because I think I was operating from a bit of a presuppositional point of view before that, where I sort of began with the presupposition that the Bible is true and that Christianity is true. And that kind of was unraveled through with evidence,
Mm-hmm.
the opposite evidence. And I needed evidence to the contrary. But I so appreciate that you said that because I do think that there are really good points on both sides. And I would love to see people from both sides of the fence, whether they're presuppositionalists or evidentialists, come together a little more because I think there's value in both. And I think where that value or where that comes together is really the point of conversion because obviously, and this might lead us into one of the misconceptions about apologetics. And one of the things that I hear is people will say, well, apologetics can't save you. And you know what? I agree. Apologetics can't make a dead heart live, but it can lead somebody more toward the water. Like you can lead the horse to the water, and of course you can't make him drink. But I think there is a great value in bringing evidence. And so I'm sort of sympathetic to the presuppositionalists on a certain aspect of that. But then I'm also sympathetic to the evidentialists in knowing that there are people out there that really have intellectual blocks even
Mm-hmm.
that they can't even see the cross. And I can't remember who said this, but it's like apologetics is a way that we can clear some of those obstacles. And that doesn't
Mm-hmm.
discount the fact that the Holy Spirit could just completely change someone's heart and they
Right.
wouldn't necessarily need those evidences. So I appreciate that you said that.
Right.
I
Mm-hmm.
think that depending on what the person actually needs in the moment could be the right method to use. And like I said, people probably on both sides are listening to me going, well, she doesn't I probably don't understand, the deep ins and outs philosophically, but I know the average person doesn't either. And so I think that just whatever is necessary for the particular
Yeah.
problem, I think is the way to
Mm-hmm.
go.
Well, that's what Francis Schaeffer said. And of course, he was a very thoughtful person. He had a very well developed Christian worldview, and he studied under actually the great evidentialist Machen and the great presuppositionalist Van Til, and actually brought those together, I think, for a
Yeah.
very compelling and winning kind of method. But no, apologetics doesn't save you. Preaching doesn't save you. Prayer doesn't save you. God saves you. And God can use apologetics. He uses prayer. He uses preaching. And they all have a role to play to bring somebody to saving faith in our Lord Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
So we offer it up, with empty hands. Here it is, Lord. I want to take it to the world. We need to serve the poor and build up the church, preach good sermons, pray for people, and also have a reason for the hope that is within us and contend earnestly for the faith given once for all to the saints, and take every thought captive to obey Christ. I've got those scriptures in my mind about how
Mm-hmm.
we do apologetics and how we do spiritual warfare related to ideas. That's
Yeah.
an important area. This is not just a bunch of stuffy scholars sitting down at their desks or their computers and hammering things out. It's spiritual warfare because there are, as Paul says, doctrines of demons, and there are demons behind the doctrines of demons who want to establish the lie and oppose the truth.
Yeah.
So we need to be prayed up. We need to keep short accounts with God. We need intercessors. I have a team of intercessors that I send out emails to probably five or six times a month.
Hmm.
All these things are very significant. And some people will be called to a particular apologetics ministry, or that will be quite a bit of their work will be in apologetics. And that's rare. Not everybody, most people can't do that. But everybody is called to have some kind of reason for the hope that is within them,
Yeah.
and to give that with gentleness and respect, and to love God with all their mind. So you might not know a lot about apologetic method, but let's say you're talking to your neighbor and he says, well, I just can't believe the Bible because it contradicts itself. Okay, you could say, where does it contradict itself? And
Right.
if you tell me, then I'll get to work and I'll give you an answer why I don't think it contradicts itself.
Right.
So you can do a lot of apologetics in the moment by considering the felt objections of unbelievers.
Yeah.
Now, it's great if you have a whole method and you've taken a class from Sean McDowell or Doug Groothuis or some other great apologist, or J.P. Moreland or Paul Copan or Paul Gould, and you've just got the chops, you're ready to go. But you don't have to have that.
Hmm.
You can, to some extent, educate yourself. And as I look back at my ministry and career, I've had exactly no classes in apologetics. I didn't go to seminary. I had a class on modern theology from Carl Henry that was tremendous back in 1981. But everything I've learned about apologetics, I've learned by my own reading and listening to lectures. I'm an old guy, so back in the day, we listened to cassettes of our favorite
Hmm.
apologists and theologians, and I'd listen to John Montgomery and Greg Bonson and R.J. Rushdoony and Walter Martin, and they call that being an autodidact, kind of a self-learner.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
there's so many resources available now at so many levels. Like when I was a young Christian, let's say in the 70s to mid 80s, most of the apologetics was at a fairly high level, and there wasn't a lot of bridging material. Now we've got so much at so many different levels, all the way from very high academic work like what a J.P. Moreland would do, and you've got apologetics for children, like Mama
Yeah.
Bear Apologetics, and you have apologetics and worldview training for high school students through Summit Ministries in
Yeah.
Manitou Springs, which is a fantastic ministry. They've been going for, I think, over 60 years.
I just got back from there yesterday.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah. Yeah. They do a great job over there.
And it's such a beautiful place to be, too.
Oh, it
It's
is.
it's a
Yes.
fun little kind of bohemian town, and right
Yes.
up there is this big old mansion teaching Christian worldview and conservative principles in this little bohemian kind of
Yes.
hippie
Yes.
town.
The holiday season is approaching, and it's a time for giving gifts that really matter. As a parent and as a grandparent, I'm always thinking about the things that are going to shape my kids' and grandkids' hearts and their minds, because so much of the content that is peddled to them out there today is really shallow, confusing, or just completely unbiblical. So that's why I'm giving brave books as gifts to the children in my life. I love this ABC book that I'm going to be giving to, I believe this one's going to my niece, where she can learn her ABCs, or maybe this one's going to the grandkids. I can't remember because they're all getting some great stuff from Brave Books. But they are a Christian children's entertainment company that help parents raise kids with character, conviction, and imagination. So right now you can go to bravebooks.com and use my code Childers for 20% off. Now you also want to check out the Brave Plus streaming platform, where there's carefully curated shows that won't facilitate a short attention span and will also promote biblical values. So again, go to bravebooks.com/Childers, and that's going to be 20% off with the code Childers. Yeah, and you know what I've discovered, because I've been going there to teach, I'm part of the faculty there, and I've been going there about, I guess, 3 or 4 years now, and I notice how much more hungry the students are every year, and I think it's because the world's getting darker and a little bit more chaotic, and so the kids that are serious about learning to defend their faith and to articulate these things are getting a little more serious, like, where I find that our porch time, Q&As are much
Yeah, I
more
love
intense
that.
as the years go on, so that's great. So maybe let's talk about another misconception. And I'm trying to find the best way to articulate this because it is the misconception that I do see mostly from progressive Christians and deconstructionists. And that is maybe something like this. It's this perception that apologetics is just like repeating evangelical talking points and almost like plugging your ears and saying la, 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 la to anything else that might challenge that. And that was kind of a puzzling characterization for me in the beginning because when I first discovered apologetics, I mean, like we mentioned before, it's so broad. There are so many disciplines. You could even just focus on one little bitty point of something like textual criticism, or maybe on the other side of that, historicity of the New Testament, and spend your entire life reading thousands of pages of scholarship, and you wouldn't even scratch the surface of that one little puddle in the apologetics pool. And so it kind of puzzled me that that was the view, but I continue to see it time after time. I was just looking at some of the YouTube comments under some of my videos, and people saying things like, "Oh, evangelical apologetics is just almost like they think it's silly or stupid, or maybe just like a little children's book. This is just the points of indoctrination. Just repeat those, and we'll call that apologetics." But I think that's a really big misunderstanding of what apologetics is. Have you encountered a
Oh,
misconception like that?
oh, yes, I have. And recently, very personally, because I interacted a little bit with a deconstruction pundit by the name of CJ Cornthwaite. And he did a video on why he thought apologetics was bad for Christianity. I think he identifies as some kind of a Christian at this point, but there's not much left as far as I can tell. But he was talking about if you really study the Bible, you see it's full of contradictions, and the biblical canon came together in some kind of unreliable way. I think he makes that claim. So I watched the whole thing, 45 minutes, and I wrote a response on the YouTube page. It had 5 points. I didn't count the words, but it was probably at least 500, 750 words. I gave references to books and scholars. And then I started to look at the comments to what I said. And there were things like, "Oh, of course he would say that. He teaches apologetics." Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, I do. So is that sort of like being a thief or a pathological liar, being an apologist? And of course, I have no degrees in apologetics. They're all in philosophy. So I looked at some of those comments, and then also CJ did a response video. I only watched part of that. I responded to part of it. And then the same kind of comments came in. Um, they're very flippant and
Mhm.
superficial. So in that case, you can either continue to interact with people that are using ad hominem arguments and just trying to insult you with no consideration of your credentials or your arguments. And the
Yeah.
arguments are what really matter more than credentials. But credentials mean something. So, you can't make someone intellectually serious if they don't want to be,
Right. Yeah.
but you can turn away. Jesus said not to cast your pearls before swine. And I don't like to think of people as swine, but there's some forums that are just not appropriate for this kind of thing. I knew the late Walter Martin, the great countercult apologist, and a very courageous character, and a character in many ways. And I was early on in my ministry, and I was doing a lot of work about the New Age movement, like my books, Unmasking the New Age, Confronting the New Age. And there was somebody I won't name who's a Christian who was accusing me of actually being a closet New Ager. It was just crazy stuff. And I talked to Walter about this, and he said, "Well, what you need to do is write this person a letter responding to the charges, send it registered mail, and then just forget about it, because he said you can fight a skunk and win, but who wants to?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah,
don't like to call people skunks, but boy, sometimes they act like it. So you've got to pick your battles and decide what needs to be done. But we live in a society where it's so easy to send out images and ideas without any intellectual accountability
that's
whatsoever.
right. That's right.
So, here's somebody who has spent his whole life in philosophy and defending Christianity. I give a pretty thoughtful response, and then all these flippant insults. Well, of course, you teach apologetics, so you're stupid.
Right, right. Well, and I
I'll go
wonder
on.
too, yeah, I wonder too though if it's a even if like the word is such like a ticking time bomb, right? It's like I almost wonder if you leave the word apologetics completely out,
Mhm,
if it would go
mhm,
differently. Because I think I shared this story with you, but when Tim Barnett and I were doing research for our deconstruction book, one of the ways that we went about our research was asking several high platform deconstructionists to meet with us privately on Zoom so that we could kind of pick their brain. And several did agree, several did not agree, like they didn't want to talk to us, but some did. And I remember very specifically one of the conversations we had with one of these deconstructionists, who, by the way, has done content against apologetics, kind of portraying it as this silly discipline that's just like, young earth talking points or something like that. They just thought it was just like this one little thing. And so as
mhm,
Tim and I were having a conversation with this person, we were weaving in apologetics into the conversation without using the word apologetics. So basically just
mhm,
giving the reasons why we believe what we do, asking questions to seek to understand why this person believes what they do, and then asking questions that might even challenge some of those presuppositions, but just in a conversational way. And what was really interesting is that this one particular person let us know the next day that the conversation had kind of blown their mind. Like they were very impacted by the conversation that we had with them. And that really was interesting to me because I thought my perception going into that conversation was that this person knew all the apologetics talking points. They knew like maybe what we were going to say about biblical reliability, and they would just be rolling their eyes
mhm,
because they've already been there, done that, because that's what they say on their platform.
mhm,
But in
mhm.
reality, they had never heard any of it before. And that was a huge eye opener to me.
Well, it is, and I've written about avoiding the word apologetics, not because I'm ashamed of it or anybody should be ashamed of it, but it just has a lot of bad connotations.
Hmm.
So a number of years ago, I was a regular guest on a radio program in Denver. It was actually on a secular station. Excuse me. And I said, introduce me as a Christian philosopher, and that's what I am, or just as a philosopher. That's what I am. So
Yeah.
I am a philosopher who's convinced that Christianity is objectively true, compellingly rational, and pertinent to the whole of life. And I've got a lot of arguments to support that. And if you think I'm wrong, let me know, and we'll talk about it. But I think the word apologetics now has a lot of bad freight. For whatever reason, there's this general reason that I mentioned earlier that it's often used as meaning a spokesman for a vested interest.
Yeah.
Or, there are people who do it badly.
Hmm.
There are people who do everything badly. You know,
Yeah.
we hope
Right.
we're not surgeons, but there are people that are bad at comedy. They're bad at teaching history. They're bad at marriage counseling. So, sure, there are people out there that are doing apologetics and not doing a good job.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because so much of it is how you use it in conversation as well. Because you can have, like you mentioned, the scenario with a neighbor who might, you might share the gospel and they might say, well, but the Bible has contradictions or something like that. Well, there's two different ways you can go about that. You can say, oh, you're wrong, and here are my reasons, and here's why the Bible's reliable. And you've just totally put that person off and they don't want to hear another thing you have to say. But as you mentioned, you might ask them, well, what specific contradiction are you talking about? Or what is it that's hanging you up? And maybe we can talk about that more. And the beauty of asking questions like that is that you don't even have to know the answer. But if you can just get to what the actual problem is, then you can do something like you said, like, hey, I want to get to studying that and figure out what I think about that. It's a really good question, and maybe we can come back and talk about that over coffee or something like that. But it really is, so much of it is how it's used. And so maybe there have been people that have used it in a way that's like a battering ram or real argumentative. And so that's what's given it this perception. But I remember listening to somebody made a podcast about an article that I had written. This was somebody that was more popular in the deconstruction and progressive Christianity space. And they were saying something like, when you're going through what we're going through, an apologetics class isn't going to fix it. And in a certain way, I understand what they mean, because deconstruction really isn't, as we articulated, as we learned in our research, it's really not based on following objective truth wherever it leads. And I think the intellectually honest deconstructionists will admit that. It's really more about figuring out what you think is, toxic to you. But what's toxic and abusive isn't really rooted in what's objectively true. It's really more on your feelings. And so that's where the postmodern element comes in, because it's sort of this self-guided process. But all that to say, apologetics, when done well, can actually work within that paradigm to actually identify, oh, okay, so this person isn't actually affirming that truth is objective or absolute. So maybe this is what apologetics will teach you. I actually need to step back a bit, ask some clarifying questions about what they even think truth is, or how they even determine what is true for them or for someone else.
Oh, it always goes back to the nature of truth and epistemology. So, for example, the Philippian jailer cried out, "What must I do to be saved? Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you shall be saved." Well, he was ready to confess Christ. He had already heard the teaching of the gospel. And so what he needed was, this is how you become a Christian. What if someone believes in objective truth, but they don't think Christianity is true? Well, then you start to give the arguments, ask the questions, talk about the person's worldview. What about the person who says there is no truth? Okay, you got to take another step back. The first question, of course, is to say, how do you know that's true? Or how can that be true if there's no truth? So you've always got to do a kind of interrogation of the person's psyche with respect to their worldview. And that shows you where to start. So if they believe, basically they're on board with Christianity, but they don't know how to become a Christian, then you show them how to cast themselves on the mercy of Christ and name Christ as Lord and confess that before people. Romans 10:9, so many other verses, Ephesians 2:8-9. What if somebody has a general sense that there is objective truth and some of it is knowable, but they've got some hang-ups about Christianity? All right, let's go to that. The person who's completely postmodern, relativistic, go there. Or there's another view called skepticism, where people say, I think there is a truth, but almost none of it is knowable.
Right.
So then you've got to go with that. And my great philosophical hero, Blaise Pascal, wrote quite a bit, is very helpful on dealing with skepticism also. So know your audience.
Mm-hmm.
And as you might know, I love jazz. And one of the terms from jazz is, to be a good jazz musician, you need to develop what's called big ears, which means you need to listen to the other musicians so you know what to play, because jazz is very interactive. It's not canned. So apologists need to have big ears. And I actually wrote an article some years ago about how some of the sensibilities and values of jazz can be related to apologetics.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, you brought up this one, that this is kind of a common misconception, and the misconception is that apologetics can answer every question instantly, or it should, or it's failed if it can't. So maybe talk
Right.
about that one.
Well, it's setting up a standard that's too high, that no one can meet. So the non-Christian might say, well, I've got this problem and that problem with the Christian message. And, unless you can answer it right now, you failed, and the whole program of apologetics fails. Well, what we're trying to do in apologetics is present Christianity as the most credible worldview. And we're doing that as finite, fallible, sinful people who are limited in character and limited in knowledge. So I'm not sort of the universal answer man or you're not the answer woman for everything. But we believe that we have enough reasons to hold the Christian faith rationally. And we have some arguments at our disposal, but some areas we don't understand as well. So, for example, in my own area, I've done a fair amount of work in what you might call scientific apologetics, or how evidence from biology and cosmology and physics relates to the existence of a creator and a designer. I've written a fair amount about that. I think I can hold my own on that pretty well, but I'm not the leading expert on that. So if someone wants to go really deep into some of the issues in physics or in biology, I'd say, well, read Stephen Meyer's book, Return of the God Hypothesis. He's the best out there. He's got a PhD in the history of science from Cambridge, I believe. He's also a very humble, articulate guy. So I can kind of go this far, but that doesn't mean you can't go further. So read Stephen Meyer on this, or, often for the reliability of the New Testament issues, I know a bit. I'm not a biblical scholar, but I have studied a bit. I can take you about this far. But I say, if you want to really get into the weeds and work this out, then go read Craig Blomberg or Craig Keener. Or if you want to talk about manuscript issues, go to Dan Wallace. He's the expert on textual issues, and Ed Komachevsky and so on. So I think anybody who does this needs to know what their wheelhouse is and then what's outside of their wheelhouse. But you can say, okay, I can say this, and this, but if you want to go deeper, go into these other sources.
That is such a fabulous point, because I think one of the most powerful ways we can use apologetics, especially in a postmodern culture that is so interested in individual stories, that is something that you do see from a postmodern culture, is that people are very story-driven rather than maybe fact-driven. And you can use your own story to lead someone into your own thinking. Like, one thing that I'll often do, when I first started doing apologetics publicly, when I started my blog in 2016, I did feel like I had to know all the answers. So if I did a Q&A and somebody asked me about, bacterial flagellum or something, and I didn't know the answer, I would have shamed the name of Christ, and I wouldn't know.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this many years later, I'm perfectly comfortable if somebody were to ask a question like that to say, look, I really don't know. Scientific apologetics is just not how my brain works. I've read a few books, and I think, I prefer to spend my time more on the textual criticism stuff and the biblical reliability stuff. That's kind of what more interests me, and more things like looking at progressive Christianity versus historic Christianity. But like you said, there are these great authors that have really dug deep on those things. And I want to just, commend
Mm-hmm.
their work to you. And that's
Right.
the way that we can share some of this material using our own story. And one of the ways, one of the people I think that does this so brilliantly is J. Warner Wallace. He has sort of carved out his own niche in the apologetics world, because he's coming to apologetics from the perspective of being a homicide detective. So when people are talking about biblical reliability, he'll say, well, the historians do it this way, but as a cop, here's what I'm thinking. Here's how I think about
Mm-hmm.
those things. And I've really learned a lot from him about that, to bring my own perspective into it. So when somebody asks a question, rather than feeling like I need to throw out like 10 propositions that are truth bombs, I can say, well, as I've thought through that question, here's the way that that my thinking has gone. And I know that I have further I need to go on it, but here's what has led me to these conclusions and has given me enough to go, yeah, I can trust this. And I think that's one way, even as moms can do this with your kids. You can share just from your own experience about the way you've thought about things. I tried to write my first book from that perspective, where I'm just like, this is my story. These are the questions I had. This is where I found my answers. And maybe that can help somebody along the way. So I think utilizing a good delivery system for apologetics can be so powerful. And each person is going to maybe have a different delivery system as far as how they're going to present the information they've learned.
Right. People have different gifts, different backgrounds, different abilities. We should all have the passion to make Christ known to a needy world, but that can work in different ways, and also different ways in different seasons of life too.
That's right.
I started out ministry in campus ministry, and I did a lot of research and speaking and mentoring. And then eventually I got my PhD and became a full-time professor, and things changed a bit. But I realized early on that my call was to teach, preach, and write in a way that would commend the Christian faith as true, rational, and pertinent to the whole of life. And by God's grace, I've been able to do that all these years in one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, we want to definitely tell our audience about your books. Of course, you've been on to talk about several of your books. The last one, which was The Knowledge of God in the World and the Word, I think, is that the one you co-wrote? I'm
I
trying to.
did with Andrew Shepherdson.
Yeah, Andrew, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there
Hmm.
it is. Yeah, so I would just commend to our audience to go back and listen to a couple of those episodes. That one in particular that we talked about with him and you, I think we even talked through some of the very basic arguments for God's existence and kind of building a case that way. So that could be really helpful to people. What else would you leave our audience with as far as where they can start with some of this stuff? If they've
Hmm.
heard this and they go, yeah, I want to be able to do that. Where can they start?
Well, there's a lot of resources available on my webpage, douglasgroothuis.com. There's so much out there. In terms of my own work, my major work is called Christian Apologetics, the big volume. The subtitle is A Comprehensive Case for Biblical Faith, which is not actually true because it's not comprehensive. I didn't deal with everything, but I gave it a good shot to touch on everything I thought was significant that I could write on. And then at a bit of a simpler level, the book with Andrew Shepherdson called The Knowledge of God in the Word and the World, an introduction to classical apologetics. But there are so many good resources out there and new ways of doing apologetics or emphasizing ways that have been done before, like cultural apologetics. Have you had Paul Gould on your show to
No.
talk about culture? You definitely need to do that.
All
I'm
right.
going to check in on you.
Okay. All
You have to
right.
have Paul
It's my
because
assignment.
he is developing some tremendous chops on. Schaeffer, of course, did this, and other people have been doing this for years. But he's got a way of approaching apologetics and culture that awakens people's imagination to the truth of Christianity. Holly Ordway has done this kind of thing too. I don't know if you've had
Mhm.
Holly on,
I haven't, but I
but
did quote her in one of my books, I think.
yeah, that's very significant. Bringing in literature, film, making Christianity interesting and attractive such that people would want to investigate it, not just here's the arguments for God and the resurrection of Jesus, but does anybody even care? Why look at the arguments for God from science or from history if it doesn't engage your emotions, it doesn't engage your
Yeah.
imagination? So that'll be a tremendous place to go. I think Paul Gould's book, Cultural Apologetics, um, the whole Schaeffer corpus is still worth reading. Just start with the ones had the most influence on me, The God Who Was There. Came out in 1968, but still very pertinent. And one thing I love about Schaeffer is that you feel his heart in his writing. He really loves
Yes.
non-Christians. And you can see that by the stories that he tells and the way he puts it. He says, these are broken people. These are desperate people. They need Christ, and we need to listen to them. And he says, it's hard to talk to modern people sometimes
Yeah.
because of the errors, the despair. But that's what he did in his ministry. And he wrote some tremendous material. But Os Guinness says that Schaeffer was actually far better in one-on-one evangelism than he even was in his books.
Wow.
He said he was a genius on one-on-one evangelism. So that's what
Wow.
I hope people will do. They won't just become knowledgeable apologists, but they'll take it to the streets in one way or the
Yeah.
other.
And are you still doing your podcast, Truth Tribe?
I am. Yep.
All right. So that's called just the Truth Tribe podcast?
Just called Truth Tribe, one word.
Okay.
Comes out once a week on Life Audio.
Okay. And what kind of topics do you mainly hit on your podcast?
Mostly apologetics, cultural criticism, ethics. Sometimes I have some fun and do some cultural work on music like jazz. Those are some of
Mhm.
my least popular of all my podcasts. I think I made $15 one month when I was doing uh,
But those are
jazz
probably the ones you
podcasts.
love the most, right? Those are
Yeah,
your
I did
favorites.
really.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, it's like the lost cause of music. But I often will read an article that I've written. I've done a little bit about philosophy and theology of AI,
Mhm.
a lot of different things.
Very good. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank my guest, Dr. Doug Groothuis, for coming on the show again to talk about misconceptions in apologetics. And I hope that this has been helpful and clarifying for a lot of you who have been watching and listening to get back in the game and use apologetics in a winsome and persuasive way. And let's remember, as we pursue Christ, let's keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.